What is up? What is up? You are listening to Locked On NBA Draft. This is your host, Rafael Barlow from NBA Draft Junkies. Got an awesome guest today. He has written a book, and the book is up my alley. I'm a big fan of the NBA Draft, obviously, and this is a book that details information regarding the NBA Draft, and it's called Built to Lose: How the NBA's Tanking Era Changed the League Forever. And my guest today is Jake Fisher. What is going on?
How you doing, man? Thank you for having me. Yeah, the draft is one of the most fascinating elements of the league, in my opinion. So happy to dive into overall draft and the drafts we detailed in the book today.
What made you decide to write this book? How long was the process and information gathering? It seems like a very tedious task.
Yeah, it was tedious, but I end up over time. Typically I'm working on a bigger idea. For a while at Sports Illustrated, that's what I would do, and then eventually this became a book, not a story that would come out in 3 months. And I wanted to write it because I started covering the Sixers for Liberty Ballers for SB Nation right when Sam Hinkie got in charge of that team. Excuse me. And I was an intern for Slam magazine, and then I was going to school in Boston and moonlighting as an NBA reporter for Slam at night at TD Garden. And people forget that 2013 draft when Sam traded Drew Holiday to New Orleans for Nerlens was the same night that the Celtics pulled the big KG Paul Pierce Brooklyn trade. So there was a lot of teams around the league tanking for that 2014 class, with Embiid, Wiggins, and Parker considered to be the best class since 03, right? And being in Boston, going to those games at TD Garden, covering Philly from afar, I felt like I was in like the eye of the tanking hurricane, and spin that all forward, looking for a bigger project to sink my teeth into. Around 2017, that's when a lot of reform got passed. And from there, for the next 3 years, pretty much, I talked to over 300 people, from players and coaches to agents and executives and all types of figures around the NBA, to kind of really get a sense of what happened behind the scenes and kind of showcase different examples of team building and roster construction and draft process. And I think there's a lot of new info in there that people are going to like from all that effort.
Yeah, I can't wait to get the book. I placed my order, so it should be coming any day now.
Thank you, man.
And I'm one of these people that if I open a book, I can shut down my entire social life for days until I finish it. Like, I have a hard time reading a chapter, coming back a week later. I literally go all the way through it. And just based off of everything that I've heard and read about this book, I imagine that I'll be done with this book within the next 7 days once I receive it.
I have a couple friends who they read it in a few days, and that was the goal. I wanted it to be, it bounces from Philly to Brooklyn to Phoenix to Sacramento to Orlando. Like, you'll see the tanking process Sixers go into Staples Center in the end of 2013, that December, early January, when they go on that big road trip, and then you'll leave that game through the Lakers, pivoting from locker room to locker room. So it does bounce, and it has some pace to it that I think will make people enjoy it, definitely.
Let's start with the Sixers. So I have some friends, I won't mention their names, and they were part of the Hinkie special. I don't even know how to label the contracts that they were given.
Yeah.
And then I can name 3 guys that I know personally that were part of that group. Tell me more about your time around that team or covering the Sixers at the time when they were tanking, because I feel like tanking has always kind of been around. I can remember, it was a little bit before my time, but I can remember the whole story about the Knicks and the Patrick Ewing tanking situation. And Philly, I feel like, was the first team that was brutally honest about what they were doing.
Yeah.
Tell me about your experience just around the team, or around, the stories at that time.
Yeah, I definitely say the book is an anecdotal history of a lot of different case studies of tanking and rebuilding. So Boston, they traded KG and Paul Pierce, moving on from their veteran core before it was too late, versus on the other side of the aisle, the Lakers were holding on to Kobe and refusing to admit that he was no longer in position to be a contender.
Mav too. What did you say? Would you say the same for Dallas with Dirk? Their loyalty?
Yeah, I would say so. But but the Lakers end up inadvertently being the worst team in the NBA over a 5-period stretch. So Dallas,
Yeah.
wasn't at the top of the lottery picking 2-3 straight years like the Lakers were.
Right.
But to your question, Philly is in there to be, they are the most brazen, bald, open, transparent process, for lack of a better word. And you're right. I think the way that Sam went about his methodology of being unapologetic, of really playing the NBA for a value system, like we've seen a lot of these analytical minded executives. I mean, I just came from Sam Presti's Zoom press conference before I jumped on with you, and he was talking about the NBA as an ecosystem and margins of error and all these types of terminology that are really commonplace these days. And Sam, took it to the nth degree. I believe that Hinkie special, like he talked about, that 4-year non-guaranteed deal that he refused to back off of for a lot of people. I mean, I talked to Dwayne Dedman and his agent Mike Silverman for the book. I thought maybe that's someone you're referring to.
Yeah, those are my guys.
Yeah, and I mean, Sam pretty much told him at the deadline in 2014, like, hey man, wait it out. After he had 2 10-day contracts, after the deadline, we'll probably resign you. And sure enough, he only was going to say, like, here's our 4-year non-guaranteed deal. Like, that's it. And, sure enough, Orlando swipes in. They give him a couple more $100,000 of guaranteed money, and they lose Dwayne Dedman, who Brett Brown loved. And Dwayne became a pretty legitimate center in the league. And I know Philly fans, even a couple of years ago, before they signed Dwight Howard, were considering Dedman to be like a potential backup to Embiid, which, it would have been good to have him along the whole ride, right? So Hinkie definitely, made some enemies and rubbed some people the wrong way with his negotiating style. But I think that was, there was a method to all that madness. Like, he did think he was operating in the best interest of Philly and, preserving every cent on that cap sheet and putting the team in the best position to be where they are today, which is obviously the 1 seed in the East and looking like a perennial contender moving forward.
Do you think he'll get another opportunity in the NBA, or do you think his name has such a negative connotation behind it that some owners may be scared to touch him?
I think he would have had another opportunity if he wanted it already. What I've learned more and more, the closer I get to this and the more conversations I have with people on the inside, it becomes so apparent how important ownership is. And what I think made the Philly opportunity attractive to Sam to begin with was it was billed to him as like a real direct partnership with ownership, and they were on board to do this strategy. And then the rug got pulled out from under him. And I think Sam realized that there's a lot of teams in the league that are not like Danny Ainge in Boston, or like Pat Riley in Miami, or maybe Tim Connolly now in Denver. Like, there's just as much changeover in ownership as there is on benches and there is on rosters. And if you don't have that ownership trust, that you got nothing as a GM. And I don't think Sam will ever trust an ownership group ever again. And I think that's why he has, started a venture capital fund or whatever it is out in the Bay Area. And he's more in that tech investing space now. And it doesn't seem like he's got any interest in coming back to the league.
That's so interesting to me because, and I'm pretty sure you can probably relate, that most guys that are in this basketball world, I mean, not saying that they don't have other interests outside of basketball, but it's so hard to like get in position. Hinkie had a job that only one of 30 people had at the time.
Yeah.
And to work your way up the food chain and then be totally cool with not being involved again, I usually find that pretty hard to believe. But I don't know how many years it's been. Maybe I guess it's been like 5 years or so now, or more.
It's been 5 years since he resigned.
Yeah, since he's been out. And I mean, I heard what he was doing in the Bay, but I always thought like maybe that itch will come back to run a team, because whether people like it or not, whether they want to admit it, his formula worked. And like you said, Philly was the number 1 seed. And in my opinion, and I think it's a pretty fair assessment, they're not in that position without Hinkie. Yeah. And, whether it's Elton Brand or Daryl Morey, they're reaping the benefits of Hinkie's plan. And I part of me feels like it's kind of unfair that he's not able to fully get credit if Philly ends up winning an NBA title this year.
I think he'll get a lot of credit. I think the people in Philly, especially the Rights Ricky Sanchez podcast guys, if you've heard of them, the people who raised a banner to him in the rafters of this big sports complex bar, right in the down in South Philly, right in the same complex as their stadium. I think he'll get credit, but you're right. I mean, I think the whole reason they're here right now is Joel Embiid, right? I mean, he's an MVP candidate. He's one of, if not, the best two-way players in the league. And the Hinkie's strategy was the only reason that he's in Philadelphia. He worked out for Cleveland that year. And by all accounts, Cavs officials maintain to this day that Embiid broke his foot during that Cavs workout. And they couldn't take him. They were considering the fact that LeBron might re-sign there. And they were considering the fact that they needed to, get back towards contention. It had been, a bunch of years since LeBron left in 2010, and they hadn't even come close to the postseason. So they weren't taking a guy who broke his back in Kansas and then broke his foot. Milwaukee with the same thing. In the Bucks ownership, I have Mark Lazary on the record in the book saying that they couldn't take Embiid over Jabari, and that they were looking probably to take Jabari over Wiggins before, when Embiid was tracking to be the number one pick, because they wanted a more finished product to make the playoffs that next year. So Embiid only fell to 3 because these other teams didn't have that long view that Sam had. And I believe Hinkie would have taken Embiid number 1 overall still in that draft if they had the number 1 pick even after Embiid got hurt. That's just the way that Sam operated. He was always thinking about, the quote he used was having the longest view in the room. That was the theme of that whole front office.
This is great stuff. When we return, I want to get Jake's opinion on the 2014 NBA draft class, which at the time was considered or expected to be one of the best classes in recent memory. All right, you're listening to Locked On NBA Draft. This is Raphael from NBA Draft Junkies. Have Jake Fisher on, the author of a new book. And like I mentioned in the first segment, I can't wait till my book comes. Just so far from the first few minutes of this podcast, my interest has definitely grown. But I wanted to talk about the 2014 class. I can remember like yesterday, going into their freshman seasons, everyone was penciling Andrew Wiggins in as the number 1 pick. We saw the comparisons to maybe Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant. I remember reading articles about him possibly getting like this $100 million sneaker deal. And he had a good season at Kansas. I don't want to say it was disappointing. I think a lot of I'm trying to think of the best way to word it. You always felt like there was more. You always felt like you could have got more. But again, he had shown the flashes and potential. Then you had Jabari Parker, who's like a legend in Chicago. Everyone, well, not everyone, but there were people saying that he's the best player to come out of Chicago ever. I mean, I saw some of those remarks because he has such a good high school career. And during that college season, as it went on, you saw that Embiid was probably the best player in that class.
Yeah.
So take me back to 2014 draft, and you had, these two guys that had all the hype coming into the season that definitely deserved to be, contending for the number 1 pick. And then Embiid comes in and kind of throws like a wild card into the mix. So tell me about that situation going into the 14 draft.
I mean, the hype around that class is, I think, why this tanking era even happened. Like I talked about at the top. I mean, remember, Miami was running the league at the time, and the Thunder, they were the most exemplary tank job probably of all time when they picked KD, Russ, and Harden 3 straight drafts from 2007 to 2009. They get to the finals only in 3 years later in 2012, and they run into this Heat juggernaut, right? Like the Heat and the Thunder were the perfect example of the best way to contend is to stockpile these multiple all-stars, and the easiest, most direct path to get them is at the top of the draft. And 14 was considered to be the best class since 03, without a doubt. Wiggins and Parker were on Slam magazine covers. Wiggins was like getting a torch passed down for him from Wilt Chamberlain on the SI cover. And they clashed in the beginning of that year. I forget what it was, but like November, there was one of those preseason tournaments, and it was all this hype. But you started to see in that game Embiid and what he was doing. And Bill Self all along was like telling people behind closed doors, Joel's the number 1 pick. And I think there was this game at Iowa State that January that Fred Hoiberg was the head coach at that time. He still to this day says that was the best game he's ever seen a college basketball player play. And Embiid was just, retreat dribbling out of double teams, and he had a block on one end and ran the court on the other and dunked on somebody and was doing these spin moves that like rivaled Hakeem Olajuwon, and everyone was like, holy shit, this guy is the guy. And then he hurt his back, and didn't get to play, and that obviously started to make some, murkiness and some questions on, his status at number one. But even until that Cavs workout, for sure, he was the number one guy. And I remember there was some Wasserman workout where Brian Scalabrine and a couple other people were like, it was some high school gym in California.
I think it was like Santa Monica gym or something like that.
Yeah, and he was just dunking from the foul line and making Brian Scalabrine not like, a big-time guy, but he's 6'10", hefty dude. He's throwing around like a rag doll. So people thought Embiid was definitely the guy, but that foot injury was difficult. And, I think there was it's another interesting concept being that, agents play a huge factor in this draft ecosystem that we talked about, and getting access to his medical records became a huge thing. Like, that's how big of a prospect he was. Like, he wasn't giving his medical records to Utah or Orlando, picking 4 and 5. They were trying to steer him either to Philly or then down to Boston or LA at 6 and 7. Like, that stuff is real. Like, as much as that is like fodder for, New York and Boston and Philly, whatever, like, it's definitely real. It happens every year. But you're right, all on down. Like, Julius Randle and that Kentucky team with James Young that made the Final Four. Like, Randle was super, super hyped that year. Marcus Smart, remember, people were shocked that he went back for his sophomore year, but he wanted to, improve his draft stock and get higher up. Aaron Gordon was a super athletic, ball of clay at Arizona that people were comparing to be the next type of Paul George type guy. There was a lot of star power that people expected. And, sure enough, Embiid's really like the best guy of that class, but, we're still seeing the talent. Wiggins did what he did last night for the Warriors in that play-in tournament. We're recording this on Thursday. Randall's an MVP candidate. Aaron Gordon playing a huge role with Denver right now. Like, it didn't become the 03 class, but it definitely had, a lot of star power that I think is still playing a factor in the league 7 years later.
And to me, the biggest storyline in that draft outside of who's going number one was Dante Exum.
Yeah.
And the cat and mouse game that was played there, I think he had like the breakout game at, was it like the Hoop Summit or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
And then he just disappeared. And I believe Pelinka was his agent, if I'm not mistaken. And I got him.
A story about that if you're interested. Not to interrupt you, but you're right.
I definitely want to hear it.
it was a concerted strategy to keep his value where it was and to prevent teams from really having an opportunity to knock that value down. And he was working out in like Anaheim for months, but Philly, they wanted to see him. They had a lot of pressure to draft him because remember his dad, Cecil, Brett Brown coached him in Australia.
Yep.
And Mike Carter-Williams, as much as he was the rookie of the year that year before, like there was questions about his shooting and longevity and whatever, and Embiid's injury concerns, like there was a lot of pressure for Philly to take Exum. So they went to Pelinka and said, we want to work him. This is basically unheard of nowadays. They said, but we want to see him go one-on-one against somebody. They'd worked out, I'm sure you remember, but maybe people listening might not, but Philly was working out like 150 people every draft under Sam, which is ridiculous. Most teams work out like 50 to 60 tops. Yes. Sam Hinkie was tripling that. Just to give you a sense of like how much information was of value to him, he was trying to get the most info of anybody. So they handed Pelinka a list of second-round pick type guys, undrafted type guys that they had already seen to be a barometer against Exum, and Pelinka picked Tim Frazier, who was at Penn State at the time, and they come in for this one-on-one game, which, was supposed to be a blowout, right? A top 5 pick versus a guy who should be undrafted, and it was a blowout. Tim Frazier just destroyed Dante Exum and, made him look like a high school freshman coming to the varsity practice for the first time. And that right then and there, that made a lot of people in Philly say, like, we're not considering him at 3, definitely not. And then I honestly believe Exum wasn't going to be there at 10 when they ultimately had that second pick. But I think they wouldn't have taken him at 10 too. That's how bad he was in that workout. So, Utah got word from Pelinka that he would be available at 5 pretty soon. And they started giving Utah his physical and stuff like that. And Jazz officials actually Skyped with Exum from New York last minute to like interview him quickly. Pelinka definitely did a quick pivot and tried to get his guy as high as he could, because he knew he wasn't going to Orlando either. He didn't have a great showing with the Magic, I don't believe, too. So it's just funny how, one workout, one conversation can really just pivot a whole shift of the draft, but also change someone from going to the one team or to another.
That is a perfect way to transition into our last segment. When we return, I want to get Jake's opinion on how much agents influence the NBA draft. Again, you are listening to Locked On NBA Draft. This is Rafael Barlow with Jake Fisher. Jake has been awesome on this episode. Get his book, Built to Lose, How the NBA's Tanking Era Changed the League Forever. I've placed my order. I can't wait for it to come. I'll probably be reaching out to him within the next 7 days and telling him I'm finished with the book. But what I wanted to find out now, and it's something I knew, and I'm sure he can probably give me additional insight. It's the whole agent factor in the NBA draft. You started to see, and I want to say it was more so, at least in my opinion, around that time, the agency controlled workouts, the workouts where, like I said, the agency controlled it. You only saw a guy work out to his strengths. If the guy was athletic, you just saw him do a bunch of drills of dunking and showcasing his athleticism. And I thought it was like a great strategy from the agent's perspective, but a pain in the neck for an NBA team's perspective, because not only are you drafting a 18 or 19 or 20-year-old, but now you're running into a situation where you may not get all the medical information you want to receive, and you may not get a chance to really watch him work out with your staff and see like the areas that you may have some red flags or concerns on. So can you give me like a couple like great examples of how, outside of the extra one that you just mentioned, how an agent can have a major influence on where a player goes?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you two, and they're both from Andy Miller, who is no longer a player agent. Now he's working with coaches and executives. But
that's such a weird transition to me, but
well, there's other factors that is a whole nother podcast. But
right.
The book starts in 2013. I bring you right to Nerlens' draft table in the green room in Barclays as John Calipari is losing his mind as Nerlens is falling from 1 down to 6, where Hinkie ultimately traded for him. And it's because I have from multiple people around that situation on the record, people that were at that table, that they refused to have Nerlens visit with any team picking between below 2. It was Cleveland picking number 1 when they took Anthony Bennett. It was Orlando picking 2 when they got Victor Oladipo. And from there, the Wizards were always taking CJ McCollum, or always taking Otto Porter anyway. When they CJ McCollum visited, he even told them why are you guys visiting with me? You have John Wall and Bradley Beal. You're not taking me. It was pretty clear they were going Otto Porter, but at 4 was Charlotte. They were between Cody Zeller and Nerlens. And they had scheduled a visit for Nerlens in Charlotte and then canceled it. And they wouldn't give his info to Phoenix at all either, who picking 5, which was definitely a concerted effort to make it be messaged that, my guy is not going to be available to you here. You can't visit with him because you don't even have a chance to draft him anyway. Obviously, that situation, it burned them. Nerlens fell to 6, and he lost a lot of guaranteed money. But you spin it forward to 2015 when Miller is representing Kristaps Porzingis now, knowing the Nerlens situation with Philly and how, that situation, the process was tenuous for a lot of people, Nerlens in particular. Losing like that is not great for a lot of these 19-year-old kids who win all the time. They go to college, they're treated like gods, and they go to the NBA, their dreams realized, and they lose 60 games. A lot of times that's more games than these guys have lost in their entire life combined, literally.
Right.
So it's tough. And he didn't want Kristaps, a center, to go to a team that already had Joel Embiid and Nerlens Noel, one of his other clients, who was also a center. So when they held their pro day in Vegas at Impact out there, Andy Miller told his agents and his people, don't let Sam Hinkie talk to him. Don't even let him talk to him. They refused to have him work out in Philly. One time, he was playing all these mind games. One time, they finally acquiesced, and Miller allowed Hinkie to have a meeting with him in New York. And as Sam's driving up, he was like, oh, no, Kristaps has food poisoning. I'm canceling it. But even still, Philly could have taken him at 3. That's the cat and mouse game that I think agents, you talk about, it's a pain in the ass, but the team ultimately has the right of way at the end of the day. They could have taken Kristaps at 3, but they do certain things like withholding medical info and whatnot because it's very precarious for an ownership group to approve their GM taking a guy, especially a 7'3", Lithuanian dude or Latvian, right?
Yep.
Who, he's young, he's gangly. You want to see how that body's actually going to develop and grow. And obviously injuries have been a big factor in KP's career moving forward. So Porzingis, he had a promise at 4 to New York. Phil Jackson told them that very early on. They didn't tell Philly that, but they were doing everything they could to prevent Philly from taking him, knowing that New York was that basement. I mean, he had a workout with the Lakers. He visited with Minnesota, but they knew New York was where he wanted to go and was the most likely landing spot if Philly wasn't going to take him. And they were successful in steering him out of there. So, you take your hat off, honestly, to an agent who has an idea of where he wants that player to go, and that player wants to go there, and they get it done. You're right. It's a total pain in the ass for teams, but I do see both sides of it, and I kind of respect the agents who can do it masterfully and, not cancel a meeting with somebody as they're driving to meet with them. There's artful ways to do it for sure.
Man, this is, again, great stuff. You mentioned the guarantee. Are there any stories in this book about guys that had guarantees that ended up not being guaranteed? And if so, how did that affect the long-term relationship between the front office and that particular agent?
Yeah, there isn't one that comes to mind that ruined the relationship, but Philly in 2014 at that number 10 pick that we talked about, they had promised Dario Saric that we're taking you at 10. So he's in the green room and he's ready to go. He's ready. The 9th pick goes up. Like, he's looking around at his agent like they're waiting for. They got a call, I think, at number 7 even, saying like, at 10 we're going to take you. But Hinkie was always about trying to maximize every swing at the plate, right? And they knew Orlando was picking at 12. And from people I've talked to, Hinkie had inside information from somebody with the Magic that they knew that the Magic were pining over Elfrid Payton. So he took Elfrid Payton at 10, even though they promised Dario, thinking that Dario would still be there at 12, and holding Elfrid Payton almost hostage and asking the Magic for an extra first-round pick back for him, which, before Hinkie, Philly had given up in that Andrew Bynum trade that didn't work out. So Sam didn't just take Dario. He used that opportunity to extract more draft capital to make up for their deficit previously. It worked out. Dario came to Philly eventually, a couple years later. But it was definitely perilous. And there's a chance that, Dario isn't there, or a chance that Orlando won't swing the deal, and they could have burned Dario or his agent, Misko Raznatovich. And I wonder how that would have played a factor. But that was a risk that they were willing to take, and it definitely worked out for them.
I totally forgot about that, because I remember Dario going to Philly. But what trade was that? I remember, was it part of was it like the Dwight Howard Bynum?
Yes.
Who else?
Mo Harkless, Nikola Vucevic, Iggy went to Denver. Yeah, that pick they got back from Orlando was one of the picks they gave to Orlando in that 4-team deal. So they picked Peyton at 10, and then I'm trying to remember who was at number 11, but at 12 was Orlando, and I think 11 was Miles Turner. No, that was the year after.
McDermott.
McDermott, right. So yeah, that was Denver, and they traded down with Chicago, correct? No, it was Chicago, and they traded with whatever it was.
I think it was Nurkic. Nurkic and McDermott deal? I remember seeing like this article about all the guys that Chicago had drafted and traded from LaMarcus Aldridge to Nurkic and a bunch of different guys.
Yeah, basically, they knew he probably wasn't going 11, but to get an extra first-round pick just for moving down 2 slots to get the guy that you would have taken at number 10 anyway. I mean, it's pretty ironic. That's exactly what happened with Boston and Philly in 2017 when Brian Colangelo, Hinkie's successor, came in, and by all accounts, it looks like Colangelo got bamboozled, right? Like, Boston would have taken Tatum at 1 anyway, and Markelle Fultz is no longer with Philly. So I think that irony is pretty amazing that Hinkie did that to the benefit of Philly, and the guy that ownership kind of pushed him out for kind of got burned by that exact situation, a couple of years later.
I never thought of it from that perspective. Man, this is great. This has been a great episode. Before we close, for the people who may not be convinced all the way, why should they buy this book?
I think I've given a preview of it so far. I mean, like I said at the top, I talked to over 300 people for this, and there's brand new info from Philly, Boston, the Lakers, the Magic, the Suns, Cleveland, Minnesota, Milwaukee. There's some crazy Kings shit, like Palace intrigue and infighting with the Vivek, Mike Malone, Pete D'Alessandro, Vlade Divac, George Karl carnival that was. Like, I've got crazy details that like you can't make up. That, you know, I think any NBA fan who loves rumors and NBA draft Twitter and all that type of stuff, this book's going to have so much new information that you're not going to find anywhere else. I'd appreciate the support, and if you buy a copy, I believe you won't be disappointed. So that's my final pitch.
I bought my copy, and I'm not saying this just because he's a guest on the show and it sounds good. I literally ordered my copy. It should be here within the next 24 to 48 hours, and I can't wait to read it. Thanks a lot, man. Once again, this is Raphael, NBA Draft Junkies, locked on NBA Draft. Jake Fisher has a new book, Built to Lose, How the NBA's Tanking Era Changed the League Forever. And for the listeners that want to follow you on social media, where can they find you at?
Yeah, I'm at Jake L. Fisher, Fischer, on Twitter. My Instagram presence is not very big, but that's my Instagram as well. And yeah, I'll be putting out updates about the book and my work for Bleacher Report. I write a weekly column there once a week. It's all on my Twitter. So yeah, appreciate everybody following along.
All right, sounds good. Thanks again, and we are out.